a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, along with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, longtime archaeologist, also from La Sierra University, to talk about our topic today, biblical connections with a Roman seaport city, Caesarea Maritima. We've asked Dr. Bailey Gillespie, a longtime participant in those excavations, to join us and to help us think about not only the site and the archaeology, but biblical connections as well. Bailey, tell us a little bit about Caesarea. What is it? Where is it? We'll look at some images of kind of to help us locate ourselves. But tell us about the site and tell us about your engagement, your involvement with that project.
Okay. Well, Caesarea is a Roman city that Herod the Great built day one on sand. So it's kind of an archaeological masterpiece in a way. And theoretically, we'd be able to look at all the layers in order. Of course, that's not the way it ever works in archaeology, but we hoped that we could do that. The site was started in about 22 BC. It was built on a site called Stratos Tower that was a 5th century Persian site. Hasmoneans had it for a while, the Maccabean period, the Jewish period.
Yes, this is part of the post-Jewish revolt, yes. Into and before Herod.
Right, and then
right.
When Herod the Great came, he named it after Caesar Augustus. So that's why Caesarea is called Caesarea. Right. It's different than Caesarea Philippi, which is in the north, up by Galilee. This one's by the sea, so Maritima means by the sea.
Right.
And it's about halfway between Joppa, where Jonah departed from, and currently now Haifa, or up by Tyre. And it's about 70 miles from Jerusalem. And it's built right on the Roman road, one of the trade routes, so it's a very important place.
Extremely important, significant. I mean, we're excited because of all that's there. What size are we talking about here, first site?
Well, the city itself, in Roman times, held about 100,000 people, which was the largest city, I believe, in Palestine at the time.
And it was the capital, right?
It was the capital, Roman
yeah.
capital.
Mm-hmm.
It became the capital a little bit later, but it was the capital. It has about 164 acres of ground in the city itself. And then we'll see a picture of the south and the north, where the rest of the city is, and it covers just about 8,000 acres. So
huge.
It's a huge site.
It's extremely huge.
And
site.
About 6 acres has been really excavated in all the years, starting in 1945
wow.
to last Thursday.
People wonder what archaeologists do and why they can't get all of this stuff excavated. But it's a very small percentage of a site that archaeologists actually have time to get to.
And of course, when you look at one part of a site, you often then know what other parts look like. So you don't have to, if you excavate a city block like we did at Caesarea, you'd know what other city blocks would look like because of that.
Mm-hmm. You said we. Who's we? Who did this, and what was your role?
Well, I was a part of La Sierra University's excavation team that went to Caesarea. And we were part of a consortium of 9 universities in North America. I believe Caesarea was the largest American dig in the Middle East for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. And we had students from Wheaton College and Occidental College and Middle Tennessee State and Wilfrid Laurier in Canada. We had a whole bunch of people there, and La Sierra was one of those teams. And I did archaeology as a volunteer the first year I went, under our former dean of the School of Religion, Dr. Kenneth Vine.
Right. But then you...
Well, about halfway...
You learned something about halfway
yes,
through that first season.
I learned that you could move away from the pit and move into the real world of administration. About halfway through that first year, the Antiquities Department in Israel was requiring that sites that were working with massive buildings, that the stones that had been taken up or moved had to be formalized and made permanent with cement. Right. And so they came by, the director of the dig asked if anybody knew how to do cement work, and I had learned that from my father-in-law. So I volunteered and got out of the deepest pit at Caesarea. We were excavating the northern gate and went to work with a team of young men from Middle Tennessee State to rebuild the parts that had been excavated over the years.
I think it's important to note, Bailey, that across the Middle East and elsewhere in the world, archaeology and the very business of doing archaeology now not only includes excavation, analysis, and interpretation, but preservation.
Mm-hmm.
We have to think about the future. We have to think about what this site will mean down the road, and if we can have some role in making sure it's
Well, the
going to be
conservation
there.
of the site was crucial, and now, of course, Caesarea Maritima is a national park
Right.
in Israel, and the Parks Department now controls anything that's being
Right,
done.
right, right.
Share with us your role, your title, when you got into administration.
Oh, I was administrative director of the dig, and I basically ran the day-to-day activities of the dig and made sure everybody showed up on time and
Right.
students were happy, and that
And they always were,
they
right?
were often happy. yes.
Often.
And we were all jealous because you're on the coast and you could go swimming whenever
Yes,
you want to.
after we washed the pottery, we all went swimming in the Mediterranean. Which was
But
nice.
it is warm and it is humid on the
Yes.
coast.
On
whereas
occasion.
Inland.
It's just like San Diego.
Okay, I
From
think more
California,
humid.
you know how nice that is.
Okay, maybe so.
We weren't jealous of those digging in Jordan.
No,
No,
right.
no. Well, we were in highlands, and so it was dry
Yeah.
and actually quite cool. But this says something about the varied places that biblical archaeology takes us. I mean, we talk about the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley. That's hot. You only do that in January, February, March.
right.
And so we tie these things to seasons, but we work all over the place.
Well, you can see we have a map up here. It
I
shows you
want
right where
you,
it is.
Bailey, to come over and point a couple
Okay.
of things out.
You can see Caesarea is between, this is a Roman map actually, all the city names are from Roman times. Aelia Capitolina is Jerusalem there, and you can see Joppa, Joppa, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ptolemais up at the top, Tyre. And Caesarea is right about halfway through, right on the Roman road that moves up, and Megiddo is just right about there. So we have a very important site for trade, and of course, the unique part about the site was that it had a lot of, had a beautiful harbor, which was nice. If we look at the next one, there we go. This is a map of the site as you see it today. And as one of our archaeologists on the team used to always say, that it's nice to talk about the furniture of a city. And Roman cities all had the same furniture. So once you discover this Roman city, you know what the furniture is going to be.
The basic layout, the
Yeah.
basic components.
And you can see them on this map. It's hard to read. We have an amphitheater there, larger than the one in Rome, never been excavated. Hippodrome, one of the largest hippodromes in the Middle East.
And this is for
racing, chariot races, and there were some persecutions
Didn't La
there.
Sierra University lead out in the excavation of that?
We did part of it. We did one of the boxes in the hippodrome. We also did a house up in the north, which was kind of like a villa, restaurant perhaps, it looked like. We did work up there. And then we had, there's a harbor there, a beautiful harbor that was built by Herod. There's a Crusader fortress that was built there. We have Herodian walls, which would be Roman walls, and then we have a later Roman wall, or even Byzantine period, the Christian period after that.
So sixth,
As the
seventh
city
century.
grew through the centuries. We had a theater. We had a beautiful pool where Herod's palace was. We'll see that later. A temple to Augustus was there. And the city was laid out on a grid when Herod built it. He had the opportunity to build it from scratch. And he spent 7 years putting a sewer system in the city before he put a brick on top of the ground.
Amazing.
And it's a sewer system that goes underneath the city. It was flushed out twice a day by the 1-foot tide of the Mediterranean. It was a marvel of design. And if you've ever been to Amsterdam, it was built on the same model as Amsterdam eventually was built on the map of Caesarea's sewer system. So it's an interesting connection there. But that's kind of some of the furniture that was on the city. And we excavated in most of this area in between the theater and the Crusader fortress. And the most famous thing at Caesarea is the aqueduct. I think there isn't a travel poster
That doesn't
ever
have
for
it
Israel
somewhere.
that doesn't have this aqueduct.
yeah.
This aqueduct went clear to the foot of Mount Carmel, which is 20 kilometers away. And it was a double aqueduct, so as the city grew, they had to add another one to it. There's a third aqueduct that brought water underground with a cover on it that went to the agricultural area of the city, which was in the south.
So even though they were right on the coast with plenty of water in the Mediterranean, they had to get their drinking water.
They had to bring it,
from-
yes, and they brought it from a town called Crocodilion. So you wonder what was in the water there at Crocodilion. But apparently that's how he protected the water source, by having crocodiles be in the dam of the water at the very beginning. And this thing stretches a long way. This was eroded away eventually because the beach eroded part of it away. So we lost some of that. Down in the south, you can see it looks like agricultural land. We're way south of the city here, so it shows you how large a site it was. This has never been excavated. It's all sand dunes, very difficult to excavate.
In fact, everything is covered with sand. I mean, that's what you have there.
Yeah.
In inland, you get dust and you get the rain that turns that into, you get the clay and the dirt mix. But here it's sand.
It's all sand, and it's all from North Africa, because it all comes up the coast and is dumped right here at Caesarea. And Herod knew that, and it created a natural harbor as well. There's the harbor of Caesarea, and this was a harbor that's currently existing, but you can see the shadow of the size of the harbor that was built by the Romans there by Herod the Great. They'd say it was 6,000 yards long. That's, if you're a golfer, that's a good par 5 hole. And to here, and at the end, there were statues there on the end. A lighthouse somewhere on the end that would burn 24 hours a day, they said, with natural fire. It housed troops, the 2nd Legion of Rome, the 6th Legion of Rome, and the 10th Legion of Rome lived there. So those were huge armies of the Romans that used the harbor. It later began to be silted in when the Arab invaded and took over Caesarea in the 600s AD. The harbor was closed down and it was silted in, and a lot of the building material was used by the Arabs to fill the harbor so it could become a shallow draft harbor rather than a deep harbor. And what's unique about the harbor here is because Herod the Great kind of invented hydraulic concrete, and they've excavated underwater there, and they found the boxes where he poured this concrete that was mixed with ash from Italy, from the volcanoes of Italy.
And then allowed to harden
underwater,
which was really the genius of this engineering feat.
And it was, and it built, and there are huge blocks of stone that you can see in the harbor. And of course now it's all agricultural area, so the other piece of furniture is a theater. You can't have a Roman city without a theater. Right. This one faces the Mediterranean. It's beautiful.
It's a kind of a mark of Roman cities throughout the Middle East, isn't it? But this one is so spectacular. I mean, they've done the rebuilding here, and of course they do programs.
It's part of the concert series in Israel.
And then when you're sitting on the backside, to the left in this photo, you're looking out at what?
The Mediterranean.
The Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah.
So the sunset? Watch the sunset?
It's gorgeous. I watched, heard the opera Aida there, and they brought elephants and camels up from the sea right into the theater. It was a beautiful sight. And it's spectacular. The exits there, called vomitoriums, there, and it was a freestanding theater, and it had a stage. Roman theaters always had a stage, whereas Greek theaters often were set in hillsides and didn't have stages.
Now, you mentioned the name, and it shows up on all of these Roman theaters where they'll put it, vomitorium.
Yeah.
So why did they call it that?
Well, that's an exit. It just means an exit.
Yes?
And they would go outside after they'd had a busy day eating.
And lots of food.
Lots of food, and they would find ways to come back in feeling better.
And maybe have more food.
That's right. The Crusader fortress was built later on, of course, during the Crusades. It's a late Crusader fortress, around the 1300s. Was built by Louis IX, I believe. He was a French king. He cared about design. It's a beautifully designed. It had a dry moat. And it was captured because it was such a beautiful building, because this slope won't keep anybody out. We used to climb on it, actually, when we were there. But the invaders that captured it after some of the Turks that came to capture the city just climbed up the wall. They didn't have, it didn't really protect, but the French knew how to build. They built beautiful buildings. And this still exists. It's in beautiful shape. On the other end, by the theater, is this big pool. And now, in the last few years, they've discovered this was one of palaces of Herod the Great. And he had palaces everywhere. Jericho, Masada.
Machaerus.
At Machaerus.
Yeah, it goes on and on. He always, and not that he ever lived there, but he always had these beautiful places. And you can see, this is the pool where the visitors would come. They would wait to be gone, but the water has eroded the rest of it away. And so we don't have much left except this. But beautiful mosaics down in the bottom of the water still exist there. The thing that's the most famous for Caesarea was found just right between the pool there and the...
Yeah, so let's think then. You've described so well, Bailey, the archaeology, what was discovered, the basic layout, the context, the trade routes, and so on. Biblical connections.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the best biblical connections.
This is one of the best.
This was found between the pool and the theater. Found quite early, actually. I believe 1945. It was found by the very first Italian team that came to excavate there. And it's called the Pontius Pilate inscription. And I think I have a picture of the next one that shows the inscription. There's Pontius Pilatus, prefect. We knew he was a prefect. And apparently it's an honorary inscription that commemorates the Tiberium that was apparently there at Caesarea. We're not quite certain where that was or what that was. But this is now in the Israeli Museum, and it's a famous connection, the only secular reference to Pontius Pilate, who was prefect there, governor perhaps in Caesarea at the time of Jesus.
Right.
Hence its importance, right, to people who want to know the biblical connections. Yeah.
So we like to look at secular history and see. We knew we have references to Caesarea and some secular written sources, Jewish sources, but to have someone that really had played such a key role in Jesus' life, to have an inscription showing that he was there, and no one knew that he was at Caesarea, so that was the exciting part about finding this here that shows he was a prefect here. We wanted to, since we were looking for the Roman city, you always want to look for the heart of the city. And the heart of the city is a quiz for you archaeologists. It's called the
Cardo.
Cardo, yes, which means heart, the heart of the city. So we found it by excavating down through all the sand, which was tough to get a good straight line there. You can see the tags of the layers we went through. And we excavated down to the road, and we found we excavated into an intersection. So you see the road goes this way, and then the cross street goes this way. So we have a Cardo and a Decumani. We have a cross street, which is where it was. And that became an important thing to find, because then by excavating both directions, we could find a complete city block. And then we were looking at the city plan, so this was an important discovery for us.
And you can also see in this photo the depth to which sometimes we just have to go. I mean, this looks, I mean, I didn't excavate here, but it looks fairly clean of any basic architecture until you get to the bottom.
And you can see that the pillars are falling down on the road. And of course, this is when we excavated it years ago now, last summer. This is what it looks like today. And the Cardo is open almost to the theater. And all of the area on the right side to the sea has now been excavated. And so we have a blending of the Roman period and the early Christian period, the early Byzantine period. So we have those two periods mixed up. It would be nice, I think, to think that since we had a city built on day one, that everybody would be so nice and just build nicely on top of it. That's not the way it goes.
It doesn't happen that way.
So we have reused material in all of the buildings, Roman materials in the Byzantine, Arab material on top of the next section of Turkish material. But this Cardo goes all the way. I was fortunate enough to be the one who stood up those three pillars that are still standing, so that was a good sign.
And there are pillars in the distance. They don't belong to the site.
No, that's it used to be a slurry coal plant. Now it's a gas generating plant.
Electrical
plant. Yeah. But it made a nice picture to see the pillars, the modern ones and the old ones. And of course, there would have been pillars on both sides of the road. This would have been covered, and shops would have been on each side, and it would have gone all the way down. On the building to the right is a tax building. They call it the public tax building for the government. This would have been there probably from Roman times on, because that was right at the main crossroads of the main street. This inscription is in one of the rooms. There's two inscriptions like this inside the two rooms. We uncovered it to get this picture. It's a great quotation from the book of Romans. Now, if you were the tax collector, you might want this quote from Romans 13. It's from verses 3 to 4, and the whole passage says, "For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right." And that's what's on that passage there. It's, do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right. That's a good thing to have in a public building.
Well, maybe a tax building in particular. I don't know.
But that's a great connection from Romans right there.
Oh, it's terrific.
And so Paul was there for 2 years at least as a prisoner, and I think prisoners in Bible times probably had free use of the city. They just couldn't go outside the city.
Depending on the level of it.
And so he may have been able to wander through places like that.
Right.
The most famous discovery there was a Mithraeum. Now, a Mithraeum is for the Romans was for the sun god, the god Mithra, which was actually a Persian god, a Zoroastrian god, that became a Roman god. And they would worship there, and they would sit on the benches on the side, and it was in a vault right next to the harbor. So as the ships would come in with the sailors, and they would empty all their wares into 50 or 60 of these vaults, they would then go worship and thank the sun god that they had actually made it safely.
And for a while there, Mithraism was a competitor to Christianity, wasn't it? They were
because
rivals.
it's considered the sun god.
Yeah.
And here's what we think was inside it. There was a spina that had the shape of the sun in it, a wooden spina. And then right on this little block right here was a fascinating monument, the only place anyone ever found a little seal for the god Mithra. Here is Mithra riding a bull with a knife cutting it for the blood to drain down. They used to have feasts. Friendship meals like the agape meal, like a Lord's Supper almost. So there was a very close relationship. Some say that this was even the origin of Sunday worship from the Roman period. Here's a drawing of it so you can see it a little bit better. You can see he's riding the bull, and there's a meal going on below, and people are being together.
And even though this is Mithraism, this is typical. I mean, bowls, sacrifices, food, eating, priests. This is fairly standard fare for religion in ancient times.
Yeah, and so and I think you can understand when Christians began to meet, they would want to do the same things. Of course, food's very central in the Middle East, as you know today. Even it's central for any.
And food offered to idols. Does that ever come up in the New Testament?
Well, yeah, that was the New Testament one, right? And so they knew that, and this was right. And next door to this was another interesting thing we discovered. There was another vault just next door to the Mithraeum, and you can barely see it on the wall, but there actually, it's 14 feet long, and there are 12 figures seated at a table with a Greek inscription down here from 1 Corinthians about the Lord's Supper. And Judas has been replaced by John the Baptist in this picture.
Interesting.
And it goes on and on. It's pretty dark, you can't see all of the ones, but Judas was replaced with John the Baptist because the North African Christians used to replace Judas with John the Baptist. So we knew that it's probably someone came off the boat and they needed a place to worship, and they'd come from Africa, and that's where the tide runs that way. So.
And the time period for
we think this is late Roman, early Byzantine Christian. So the transition between the Roman period and the Christian period, maybe 2nd century, 3rd century. Because you know, at Caesarea, Eusebius, the great church historian, lived there. He wrote his famous works there. Origen, this other early Christian, was there. There was a library that was attributed to him that was there. So there's lots of history there. Yeah. Let's look at a couple other things that we found. This was a beautiful mosaic of a woman, Spring. She has a basket of roses or flowers, and we found 4 of these on an honorary portico above those vaults.
4 different goddesses.
And it was all waterproof, so water wouldn't drain from the fountains above into those vaults.
Okay.
Pretty good.
And so that was a beautiful.
And so the seasons of the year.
Seasons of the year, and this was spring.
That often happens in churches.
Yeah. And this was on an honorary. There were statues found there of prefects and rulers and just great-looking people in those statues. And then one of the things that I think one of the most fascinating things we found was this little beautiful lamp, and it was drawn by one of the artists at our dig, and kind of a stylized picture of Jesus. So we're in probably the early Christian period here. It's a molded lamp, not a spun lamp on a wheel. And shows you that the impact of Christianity that it had on the very wares that the people used. You know?
And adapted for a particular audience, a particular cultural kind of consideration?
Could be. It could have been used in a religious service as a lamp. Usually you find the Byzantine lamps having motifs of flowers, the early Christian lamps. They tend to have, some will say pretty little light, others will say Jesus, the light of the world.
Right, right.
And this was kind of a transition period, so the kind of a odd-looking late Roman lamp with this figure.
So
was
point out where the wick would be and where they would fill the
wick would
with
be
oil.
here.
Yeah.
And they'd fill the oil through the fill hole there. Often they'd break that out to make a bigger hole, which makes us wonder if it was used, because it's in perfect shape.
Right.
Yeah. And it now resides in
No, it's
Israel
spectacular.
Museum.
I mean,
Yeah.
these kinds of finds are extremely rare. And especially if one can defend this as being some kind of representation of Jesus.
And of course, we know that Caesarea plays a real role in the Bible. So we can go down through this and you can see some of the things that are there. Philip was at Caesarea. He was an evangelist there with his daughters. Acts 8:40. Paul, of course, came to Caesarea. He was in prison there for 2 years, Acts 21. Peter had the vision of the animals in the sheet somewhere near Caesarea. Peter was asked to baptize the centurion Cornelius, the Gentile, at Caesarea in Acts 10. And even some little notes about Herod's last moments on earth are recorded there, that it probably took place in the theater at, in Caesarea. And everyone thinks that Paul's 3 missionary journeys left from that beautiful harbor.
Began from that harbor.
And that was the main harbor. The harbor was the largest harbor in that part of the world. It's the 4th largest Roman harbor.
Amazing.
Ostia in Rome, Piraeus in Athens, Alexandria in North Africa, and Caesarea.
And it had to be constructed because there's really not a natural harbor that big, is it?
No,
So this was all constructed.
That's all built, yeah.
So the biblical connections from Acts, we don't necessarily have something that's direct. Maybe you'll find the prison sometime, but it's so hard to connect those sorts of structures to individual people.
And of course, we know Jesus never went there. It was a
Right.
Roman city. He spent most of the time in the Decapolis cities around Galilee and then went to Jerusalem. So this was on the coast. It was a huge city at the time of Jesus. And this is where the revolt, the Jewish revolt, started, that finally went to Jerusalem to destroy the temple, the second temple of Herod. 20,000 Jews were killed outside of Caesarea, and before that happened, during the revolt. So when you dig at Caesarea, you find graves from the Jewish period to the Christian period to the Crusader period. And you have to sort all those out because the city was captured by everyone.
But you now have a context with archaeological remains, with written remains, and we would include in that, of course, the biblical remains. So that's a nice combination, a nice pulling together, if we're thinking of what we call biblical archaeology, very much so. I want to thank you, Bailey and Larry, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. We hope the program has provided some enlightenment for the mind and some food for the soul, and look forward to next time. Until then, keep believing, keep exploring, and think ancient. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.